From Sonia Massey to the sci-fi caricature, Black women have historically been subject to anti-Blackness, misogynoir, and the violence of madness in the psychiatric system. I want to explore that by further going back to enslavement in the Antebellum South and contextualizing that. I want to feature one specific quote that kind of serves as the whole precipice of my essay. In one particular alone does lunacy administration in the South differ from the same problem elsewhere in the country. What the race problem is to our whole section, so is the question of the colored insane to our specialty. Powell, 1897, as cited in Seagrass 2020, page 12. This is what Theophilus O. Powell, the superintendent of the largest psychiatric institution in North America, the Georgia Lunatic Asylum, his tenure was over 28 years, said when he addressed the American Medico-Psychological Association, the precursor to the APA, or the American Psychological Association. He was a significant academic authority in psychiatry with other asylum supervisors citing his writings, and he also served as president of multiple psychiatric and medical boards and associations. Thus, it is very telling that this is what he had to say about Blackness and madness, as he quite literally had the power to shape these institutions. This video essay will specifically explore Black women's experiences of madness and psychiatric oppression in the Georgia Asylum for Lunatics, Epileptics, and Idiots, GLA for short, in the southern United States from the 1880s to 1930s roughly. I want to start this video by saying that the terms such as idiots, insanity, lunatics are only going to be used in this video to refer to the specific language used in historical records as well as the sources. And I want to argue that the Georgia Lunatic Asylum functioned as a site of racialized psychiatric incarceration, with the asylum effectively reconstructing the conditions of enslavement to re-enslave Black women in the post-emancipation and post-antebellum South. So this is more than just the afterlife or the metaphorical legacies of enslavement manifesting within these institutions, but the post-emancipation era of the Georgia Lunatic Asylum was quite literally reconstructed, rebuilt to re-enslave and pathologize Blackness as inherently and eternally enslaved. Now, the Georgia Lunatic Asylum has been known by countless names, opening in 1842 as the Georgia Asylum for Lunatics, Epileptics, and Idiots, also known as the Georgia State Sanitarium, the Milledgeville State Hospital, and the Central State Hospital as it's more commonly known today, and referenced in the mid-20th century. Now, throughout the video, I will be referencing it as the Georgia Asylum, not only to make it concise, but also to represent what the institution was known for in my time period focus of the 1880s to the 1930s. Ironically, Black freed people weren't granted the privilege of being admitted to asylums pre-emancipation in Georgia, as they weren't recognized as citizens, therefore worthy of state care, particularly in the North. But the Georgia Asylum is one of the few that incarcerated Black people among separated but not separate asylums in the post-antebellum South, according to Downs' 2012 book. What is particularly unique about the Georgia Lunatic Asylum is just how documented the violence was. In the 2020 book, Seagrass quotes Ebony in 1949, describing the Georgia Asylum as the equivalent of a Nazi concentration camp, or the lower levels of Dante's Inferno for African Americans. Hence, I chose to focus on this specific institution of the Georgia Asylum, not just because it's one of the biggest institutions in North America, but also an institution where there's countless evidence of the worst documented violence and inhumane conditions against Black madwomen. First, I want to contextualize post-emancipation and post-antebellum Georgia in order to politicize the experiences of Black women and their madness, as well as the mutually constitutive and interdependent relationship between anti-Blackness and American psychiatry. Now, in order to contextualize this, we need to go back to enslavement in the Antebellum South, a significant time period in the States, marking the period of widespread enslavement and consequently the makings of scientific racism and the development of the psychiatric discipline, hailing from Europe and traveling over to the States. Additionally, Georgia was part of the Cotton Kingdom in the United States. The success of enslavement in cotton plantations in the Deep South was due to Georgia's dominance in the cotton market as a global commodity, as well as the monopolization of the American economy, second to only England. The expansion of enslavement meant the expansion of the American nation and the economy. After the 1861 to 1865 Civil War between the Northerners, the Unions, and the Southerners, the Confederates, that centered around the institution of enslavement, which eventually resulted in the abolishment of slavery by Abraham Lincoln in 1863, Emancipation supposedly freed Black people. Downs, in his 2012 book, however, argues that enslaved Africans and Black people might have been free from bondage. However, the disease, the suffering, the deaths that culminated during and after the Civil War was a unique type of devastation and destruction. Not only did the Civil War result in biological crises with the infrastructure and the environmental destruction and mere amount of casualties, but the emancipated free Black people lacked any type of basic necessities or support that the government supposedly promised. Essentially, Black people were left to die without any support, money, shelter, belongings, food, or medicine. The promise of freedom was never realized, and rather subjected to constant displacement, suffering, and undue death. Pro-enslavement authorities, from medical authorities to Southern politicians, subsequently justified enslavement, advocating for the plantation system to once again care for the Black people who didn't seem to know what to do with their newfound freedom. In Forret's 2016 article, pro-slavery sympathists took advantage of the plantation system, constructing a supposedly reciprocal relationship between the enslaved and owners, with owners providing shelter, food, and medicine in exchange for enslaved labor, though we do know that this is a gross sugarcoating of enslavement. Downs reveals how not only did the states promise freedom in exchange for work after emancipation, but the South recreated plantation labor through contraband camps, auctioning free people in slave pens. Now, I will focus on the Georgia Lunatic Asylum, specifically through the moral treatment approach. I argue that a similar promise of the recreation of enslavement occurred in the psychiatric institution, exploiting Black patient or inmate labor through an illustrated responsibility to contain the dangerous freed mad Black people away from innocent white society. In order to politicize and contextualize the madness of Black women, I want to talk about the legacies of scientific racism, specifically through diagnoses and diseases centered around Black resistance during enslavement. Georgia Lunatic Asylum Superintendent T.O. Powell believed that enslavement was optimal for Black mental health, citing the freedom from enslavement as the cause of Black insanity, and therefore psychiatric incarceration was the key to address the social ill of Black madness post-emancipation. Throughout enslavement that has informed psychiatry today, there were countless medical authorities and scholars that pathologized Blackness, particularly Samuel Cartwright, who was one of the leading physicians on treating enslaved Africans in Antebellum, Georgia. In the 2017 Oral History Project, Jackson discusses Cartwright's theories of Black-specific mental disorders, drapetomania and dysesthesia ethiopica. Drapetomania is the disease that causes the enslaved to irrationally run away, a troublesome disease for plantation owners and isolated to a pathological condition rather than the very human need for freedom. He would recommend whipping and keeping the enslaved in a childlike essence as a preventative measure for drapetomania. He additionally created dysesthesia ethiopica as specific to formerly enslaved and freed people. This disorder was identifiable by laziness and unwillingness to work, and even through instances in which an enslaved person would make a mistake, and most importantly, lesions. He again suggested whipping as the cure rather than the more likely cause of those said lesions and physical injuries. These two disorders are evidence of pathologizing the human need for freedom and agency and the subsequent resistance to justify how plantations would be the most ideal and, ironically, humane place for Black people. Seagrass's 2020 book explores the first cohort of free Black women to the GLA in 1867, contextualizing the Civil War, epidemics, emancipation, and the subsequent poverty that any police or federal agents would have pathologized as unstable and therefore mad. As these women were willing to defend themselves and resist white authorities, the psychiatric disciplines then pathologized this Blackness and resistance as madness in order to confine them. As the Georgia Asylum Superintendent, Dr. T.O. Powell, constructed madness and Blackness as justifications for racialized incarceration and social control. You can see the psychiatric pathologization of distress, defiance, and resistance through Alice M. in Lewis's 2022 article. The only record of her is in a 1881 article where she was declared insane by police officer Simmons during a public incident. She was holding on to a small child and began calling for help. This police officer suspected that she was either drunk or insane and subsequently arrested her before declaring her as insane. The police then took her child, who was given to a colored woman, and the article reports that Alice will be further assessed for insanity by committee at the Georgia Asylum. Even if Alice was cooperative, she still didn't have a chance against the white police officer, court system, or psychiatric system. The very justified anger or defiance or distress against white authorities, both legal and medical, were instead constructed as being difficult, being uncooperative, and therefore pathological condition to which psychiatric incarceration would have fixed. Just like Alice, too many Black women have had their distress depoliticized and decontextualized to fit the greater narrative that Black women pose as a danger to the white society and therefore are justified to be incarcerated. In the 1985 book, Difference in Pathology, Gilman exposes how the 1840 American Census reported that not only 3,000 of 17,000 people who were reported to be insane or feeble-minded were Black, but the census reported madness among free Black people 11 times higher than those enslaved, and 6 times higher than white people as a whole. Gilman additionally cites Calhoun, the American vice president, who was very pro-enslavement at the time, defended incarceration of enslaved Africans and Black people, citing how supposedly 1 out of 21 of Black people were incarcerated in jails, and 1 out of 13 Black people were either deaf and dumb, blind, idiot, insane, or in prison. Manifestations of Black resistance against the institution of enslavement always corresponded to fit under the medical model of insanity, effectively incarcerating both free and enslaved Black Africans in some shape or form before emancipation. Gilman additionally exposes how there was a sudden influx of Black madness in psychiatric incarceration in 1896 due to Black predispositions to illness, citing their simple natures or childlike essence that would not allow them to thrive in the world as free people, thus necessitating psychiatric incarceration and interventions such as asylums. This further cements the intrinsic connection between resistance against anti-Blackness and enslavement, emancipation, and freedom as consistently pathologized as madness, in which psychiatric incarceration, institutions, and interventions have functioned as sites of racialization to re-enslave emancipated Black women through anti-Black sanism. Now, I want to get more into the actual design of the Georgia Lunatic Asylum, specifically through the moral treatment approach, and how these reconstructed the conditions of enslavement and plantations to essentially re-enslave Black women. The segregated asylum conditions within the Georgia Asylum reconstructed slave quarters. For example, the Georgia Asylum's segregated building, as pictured here, they started taking in patients in 1867, eventually constructing a separate colored building due to overcrowding, with eventual expansions in 1879, 1881, and 1888, which was at full capacity. Pictured is the colored building in 1894. Pictured here specifically is the colored building in 1894, confining about 680 Black men and women in 1897 and was less than 40,000 square feet. This would have eventually been burnt down in 1897 due to Georgia Asylum staff negligence. This Union Recorder article documents this burning on November 9, 1897, as pictured here. As a result, Powell forced the 680 Black patients into tunnels turned into makeshift shelters with grossly unsanitary conditions and poor excuses for provisions. Lewis argues that these tunnels and other asylum conditions mirrored those of antebellum slave quarters through inadequate diets, hygiene, poor clothing, and just how overcrowded these conditions were with human filth, resulting in Black women dying 2 times faster than white women patients. Additionally, the way in which the Georgia Asylum racialized Black women was through the moral treatment approach and the systematic exploitation of unpaid Black patient labor that Lewis argues recalled exploitative slave labor. Pinel and Tuke's moral treatment originated from France. largely adopted by psychiatric facilities and physicians throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, advocating for a more moral approach to psychiatric treatment, moving away from restraint or corporal punishment, but rather to reflect the outside world for patients to recover. This would look like outside facilities such as libraries, chapels, settings of nature such as gardens and farms. The asylum staff was considered a family with closer connections between doctors and patients, with the staff even going as far to eat alongside patients. As the first superintendent of the Georgia Asylum, David Cooper implemented this approach in the 1840s, advocating against neglect and violence in favor of providing a healing environment. However, the fatal flaw of this approach was the subsequent authoritarianism through the rigorously controlled routines and regulation of Black madwomen. Jackson points out how Powell advocated for the strict regulation and structure of antebellum plantations, arguing that there was a reason why consumption, aka tuberculosis, was so common among emancipated free Black women in the asylums due to freedom, rather than the asylum conditions themselves. Some of the ways in which the asylum stripped the agency from Black women were through the denial of feminine essentials such as bonnets, soap, and slippers, and therefore gendered self-expression. These reflected conditions of enslavement in which Black women were not allowed to style themselves or have access to essentials or even have adequate clothing to protect against the elements that are so essential for human dignity. I point this out because these aren't luxuries but necessities, especially for women who have been dehumanized and robbed of their right to dress up, feel beautiful, feel dignified, and express their humanity through gender expression, making the absence of these feminine items incredibly racialized. Additionally, through the moral treatment approach, the exploitation of patient labor was justified that asylum labor would reflect and connect patients to the outside world as a form of occupational therapy. However, this ended up exploiting unpaid labor, all too reminiscent of antebellum enslaved labor. Enslaved labor in the 1840s, when the Georgia Asylum opened, ensured that Cooper took pride in having the cheapest operating costs compared to any other psychiatric institution, according to Seagrass's 2020 book, and that legacy is clear as day. Edwards-Grossi and Willoughby argue that asylums reproduced the carceral logics and racial control and violence of enslavement, as these institutions served as sites of medical and social control over Black bodies and minds. These carceral logics would extend through the justification of unpaid manual labor, not only to supposedly cure a mad population, but to ensure that a Black race be never truly emancipated or free from forced labor. In Lewis's 2022 article, it exposes how white women in the Georgia Asylum had roles that were relatively not as strenuous as Black women's, becoming seamstresses, cooks, and other forms of domestic labor, as compared to white and Black men performing physical labor on asylum farms and gardens, for example. Black women, on the other hand, endured physically demanding labor in custodial care that was on par with Black and white men patients' labor. Mary Roberts, a Black woman whose experiences at the Georgia Asylum were at the forefront of Seagrass's 2014 article, was reported to have been assisting with laundry and ward work, aka caring for other patients, quite literally assisting with operating the asylum. Lewis reports how Black women would die faster than white women due to just how strenuous and physically demanding their work assignments were. As the moral treatment approach wanted to reflect the outside world, farms and gardens to grow food were developed to fulfill these efforts. In the 2017 Oral History Project, Jackson reveals that the GLA's farm had exclusively been run and operated by Black labor for a large chunk of the late 19th and 20th centuries, especially considering how psychiatric institutions such as the Georgia Asylum would further segregate patients based on their ability to work. It is clear that Powell had turned the moral treatment approach into another workhouse with unpaid labor, making Black women's labor as the ultimate foundation of not only the Georgia Asylum, as well as the New South post-emancipation. A specific way in which the Georgia Asylum operated as a site of racialized control over Black women was the denial of womanhood through the indeterminate separation between family and patients, and even community. In the 1987 article, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, Spillers argues that Black men and Black women were ungendered by enslavement, particularly through stripping Blackness to flesh and bodies with no personhood, effectively rendering them ungendered and robbing their access to gender through roles, norms, structures. Due to the fact that under enslavement, Black women were not only subject to sexual violence by their white owners and had their children taken away from them either through sale or auction or murder, they were also forced to undergo the same grueling labor as Black men, constructing Black femininity and Black womanhood as far away from white womanhood and normative womanhood as possible. As a result, freedom for emancipated Black women meant the ability to mother their children fully, without fear of their child being displaced, stolen, sold, or killed. In Lewis's article, Black women consistently negotiated their labor roles so they could mother their children, stay with their family, and maintain their family unit. As Powell argued to separate patients from their families and communities as part of the moral treatment approach, he also removed any familial causes or circumstances that would lead to said madness incarceration. Thus, the severance of Black family units through the separation reconstructed the denial of motherhood that was endured during antebellum enslavement within a post-emancipation Georgian asylum, especially considering how important the promise of legal marriage was for emancipated freed people. Legalized marriage allowed families to be recognized and for children to belong to their parents rather than white plantation owners. Lewis argues how honorifics in the patient intake ledgers for white women were incredibly important, ensuring that these relationships represented by Mrs. or MS, Miss, could be leveraged to claim sanity and therefore leave. Being a mother and a wife is incredibly racialized, in which Black women have been robbed of. This forced separation of Black women from their spouses, husbands, and children fulfilled the ultimate theft and destruction of Black womanhood and Black femininity to ensure that the enslavement of Black women's bodies continued. Subsequently, Blackness and Black femininity have been pathologized as disruptive, aggressive, violent, dangerous, and ultimately threats to the social order of post-antebellum Southern white society. You can look at the differences of womanhood between white women patients and Black women patients, with white women being considered passive, fragile victims that needed to be saved so they can continue recreating for the white nation, while Black women were forcibly sterilized and had their children taken away because they were dangerous. The deliberate erasure of racialized distress, as well as the social realities of anti-Black violence, attributed Blackness and Black womanhood as inherently violent as a result. Therefore, the Georgia Asylum was never just a hospital or a sanctuary to treat those experiencing distress, but it was and continues to be a site of racialized social control and incarceration, in which Black women were forcibly confined, stripped of their autonomy, and had their labor exploited under the guise of psychiatric treatment. Through the moral treatment approach, the segregated asylum conditions, and the pathologization of Black resistance, the Georgia Asylum reconstructed the conditions of antebellum enslavement, transforming emancipation into another form of incarceration, effectively reflected the antebellum plantation system, with Black women performing back-breaking labor while being denied the dignity of gendered self-expression, the right to motherhood, and the ability to exist outside a framework that defined them as dangerous, unstable, and subhuman. Powell and other psychiatric institutions justified these conditions through scientific racism, through diagnoses of drapetomania, dysesthesia ethiopica, or insanity, framing Blackness itself as a disorder that justified any type of control and violence. Black women, whether they were resisting or simply just existing, had their distress depoliticized and medicalized in order to justify their imprisonment at these psychiatric institutions such as the Georgia Asylum. This asylum was not an outlier, but a reflection of how enslavement, psychiatry, anti-Black Satanism, supposed freedom and emancipation worked hand in hand to ensure that Black women never truly experienced freedom. The so-called promise of emancipation was constantly undermined by systems of control and surveillance, from asylums to Jim Crow laws to the carceral logics that we see today. So when we talk about madness, incarceration, and institutionalization, it is urgent that we understand that psychiatry, medicine, and science as a whole is never truly value neutral or completely objective. Instead, they were built on the literal backs of Black labor, suffering, and oppression. This legacy is still true today, because if we look at the conditions of psychiatric institutions, hospitals, prisons, and other carceral spaces today, I have to ask you, has anything really changed?